Before Tyson Beckford became fashion's most famous black male face, Sterling St. Jacques was already moving through rooms most men could never enter. He walked for Yves Saint Laurent, drew attention at Givenchy, danced beside Pat Cleveland, and became part of the Studio 54 world where beauty, power, and danger shared the same floor. People remembered his gray eyes, his height, his elegance, and the way he moved. Yet the basic facts of his life still refused to settle. His birth year shifts, his family story changes on paper, his death date breaks into competing versions. Even the famous song tied to his name slips between memory and myth. Sterling reached the center of fashion's brightest decade, then left behind a record full of shadows that still resists easy explanation. First, black male supermodel sounds like justice when it is attached to Sterling St. Jacques. It gives a scattered life a shape history never properly gave him. It also asks more from the surviving record than the record can give. By the time later, writers placed Sterling near the beginning of black male supermodel history, the usual timeline had already hardened around Tyson Beckford. Sterling complicates that timeline because he moved through high fashion rooms long before Beckford became a Ralph Lauren figure. Yet supermodel meant something different in the 1970s. It usually belonged to women whose names traveled beyond the runway through covers, contracts, gossip columns, cosmetics deals, and mass media. Male models rarely received that machinery. Black male models received even less of it. Sterling arrived before the category had room for him. He had the visibility, beauty, access, and cultural charge that later supermodel narratives would require, but the industry had no stable system for protecting a black man's place in that history. Beckford's breakthrough came with agency structure, major advertising, televised celebrity culture, and a brand that kept using his image. Sterling's breakthrough came through runway rooms, nightlife, photographs, fashion columns, and personal memory. That difference does not diminish Tyson Beckford. Beckford changed the public market for black male beauty in the 1990s, and his importance is real. The harder problem sits with the industry that preserved one breakthrough cleanly while leaving an earlier figure scattered across photographs, diary entries, fashion notices, memoirs, and rumor. The rooms remembered him long after the business failed to hold him clearly. That gap became part of him. Sterling reached elite fashion rooms before black male beauty had a reliable path to celebrity. He had the photographs, the presence, the designer connections, and the nightlife fame, but not the structure that later turned models into protected names. That is why his place feels both obvious and unstable. He was visible enough to be remembered, but not secured enough to be easily claimed. He belongs among the earliest black male fashion stars. He belongs near the beginning of the first black male supermodel debate, even if the archive never gives him a clean crown. What remains is sharper than a title, enough proof to see his importance, and enough absence to show how easily that importance was allowed to dissolve. Sterling enters the record before his identity becomes steady. Early notices know him as Sterling St. Jacques, while later fashion and music traces drift into other spellings, other dates, and even earlier name claims like Sterling Coulter. On paper, the details blur before the person sharpens. That uncertainty follows him from the beginning. It suggests a public self built in motion through choice, survival, access, and reinvention. The name that lasted gave him elegance. It also gave him a way into rooms where reinvention could look like destiny. By 1971, he was visible enough for the Deseret News to mention him as a laugh-in dancer returning to his native Salt Lake City. That small notice comes before the Studio 54 legend, before the Givenchy stories, before the European disco trail. He was already a performer. He was already Sterling St. Jacques. He was already entering print through motion, television, and a bigger life. Even his age refuses to stay still. A 1972 report involving Raymond St. Jacques' Bel Air home described Sterling as 22, pointing toward a birth year around 1949 or 1950. Later, databases move him to 1957. Others land closer to 1951. The dates compete, and none of them takes control. His face survived with more confidence than his biography. Raymond St. Jacques made the name powerful. He was a major black actor, director, and activist whose career included Rawhide, Cotton Comes to Harlem, and Book of Numbers. He carried presence and authority in a Hollywood that rarely gave black men that kind of room. Sterling entered public life near him, and Raymond introduced him as a son. That family language opened a door, but it also left a complicated shadow. Raymond understood image, respectability, and the cost of being a black man under public attention. Calling Sterling his son gave the younger man a place beside him. It also created a bond that looked clear in society pages and less clear when the legal record arrived. After Raymond's death, probate coverage in Jet said Raymond's will listed no children. Sterling appeared there as a nephew and received $1 from an estate valued around $750,000. The paper left no explanation for Raymond's feelings, Sterling's expectations, or what had passed between them privately. It only showed how sharply a relationship could change once it moved from public language into legal form. Later, queer cultural memory added another layer. Michael Musto read Raymond and Sterling through a different lens in writing about queer nightlife and celebrity. Pat Cleveland's memoir also describes Sterling's relationships with men and a connection with Hubert de Givenchy. Those memories carry weight, but they stop short of final certainty. Raymond presented Sterling as a son. The will used colder language. Later accounts suggest a private life with more than one meaning. Sterling's name gave him access, protection, and glamour. It also left him partly hidden inside the words people used for him. Sterling's fashion life began with movement. Before the runway photographs, he was already a dancer. By 1971, the Laugh-In credit gave him a national television trace, and Raymond's 1973 film, Book of Numbers, placed him near screen work and performance before his fashion image hardened. That is why ordinary modeling language feels too small for him. Sterling did not enter fashion as a blank body for clothes. He entered with timing, rhythm, posture, and the kind of physical command that could make a room turn toward him. A photograph could hold his face, his height, his clothes. But the thing people kept describing was motion. Later descriptions returned to the same details: the gray eyes, the tall frame, the elegance when he danced. Pat Cleveland became the person most often linked to that side of him. Together, they looked less like two models posing and more like a performance moving through fashion, nightlife, and art circles. Warhol noticed them, editors noticed them, club people noticed them because in that world, dancing could become status. Givenchy saw that quality too. Sterling's value came from more than how a suit fit his body. At the 1976 Givenchy menswear presentation at the Waldorf Astoria, his effect drew a Fred Astaire comparison in the New York Times. That name carried a specific kind of glamour: ease, discipline, lightness, control. Sterling's walk belonged closer to performance than ordinary garment display. The same gift that opened doors also made his legacy fragile. Live presence depends on witnesses. A show ends, a dance floor clears. A person who once changed the air can be reduced to a caption, a diary line, or a memory. Fashion and nightlife rewarded Sterling while he was in the room. Once he was gone, they had little ready to preserve him. His power lived in the moment, not in storage afterward. Sterling's fashion career does not need extra decoration. The work that can be seen already gives him a place. One of the clearest traces is an Yves Saint Laurent runway image. Sterling with Pat Cleveland during the spring 1975 ready-to-wear period, dated October 1974. In that image, he is not floating outside fashion history. He is standing inside it, beside Cleveland, one of the black models who helped change what runway presence could look like. Givenchy gives him another fixed point. In April 1976, the New York Times covered Givenchy's menswear presentation at the Waldorf Astoria. Sterling's performance drew the Fred Astaire comparison, which says more than a simple credit ever could. He was being seen for timing, elegance, and control, not only for how he carried a suit. The clothes mattered, but his movement made the moment memorable. Halston's world is harder to pin down in the same way. Sterling appears around that scene through Pat Cleveland, WWD items, Warhol diary entries, and the Studio 54 circle. He belongs in the Halston-era atmosphere of fashion and nightlife, but the clearest evidence places him closer to the scene than to a major campaign. His place there comes through proximity, social life, dancing, and the rooms where fashion blended into celebrity. Yves Saint Laurent and Givenchy remain the cleanest designer links. Halston works better as atmosphere, a world of Pat Cleveland, Warhol diary entries, WWD notices, Studio 54, and rooms that spilled into nightlife. Willie Smith, Stephen Burrows, and Versailles belong outside his firm credits until his name appears with stronger grounding. Sterling had enough power without borrowing every famous name. He moved through fashion as more than a runway model. He was a dancer, companion, muse, performer, and nightlife figure, magnetic in person and difficult to preserve afterward. Later, male supermodels became known through brands and campaigns. Sterling became known through rooms, and rooms forget once the lights go down. The Battle of Versailles in 1973 reshaped how fashion remembered performance. 5 American designers faced 5 French houses at the Palace of Versailles, and the American presentation moved with a speed and looseness few expected. Black models were central to that impact. Pat Cleveland, Bethan Hardison, Alva Chin, Billy Blair, and others helped turn the night into a landmark. Sterling is sometimes pulled toward Versailles because so much around him seems to point there. Pat Cleveland, runway performance, French fashion, high society rooms, and the same fast-changing world of black models changing the room. The connection feels natural. It also remains unsettled. Versailles has been retold through photographs, documentaries, books, and anniversary pieces, and the women who carried the American side appear again and again. Sterling does not appear clearly among those central figures. Putting him there would make the timeline neater, but Sterling's life already shows how dangerous neatness can become. He belonged to the same fashion current, close to its people and its energy, without needing a place on a runway that has not firmly held his name. Versailles still explains the period around him because it shows what the early 1970s allowed Black beauty and movement to do when the door opened, even briefly. It proved that walking could become theater, that a model's body could change the mood of an entire house, and that performance could defeat pedigree. Sterling's own rise lived inside that same atmosphere, though in a looser network of shows, clubs, private rooms, and entrances. He stood near a revolution in fashion presentation. He worked with people who helped create it. He carried the same blend of beauty and presence that made the American side feel alive. Versailles helps explain his world, even without making him one of its documented figures. Pat Cleveland sits at the center of Sterling's private story because she knew him in ways photographs alone cannot explain. She appears beside him in images, in memories of his dancing, and in the emotional trail that still surrounds his name. Their engagement gives his life one of its few intimate anchors. It also leads into the question that followed him through fashion, nightlife, and rumor. Who was Sterling allowed to be in public? Cleveland later wrote that the engagement ended because Sterling preferred men. That detail belongs in the story, without becoming the only way to define him. Sterling left no stable public statement explaining how he named himself, and the world around him often spoke in code. He moved through queer and queer-coded spaces, and later accounts place major relationships with men around him. What survives points toward desire, secrecy, protection, and a private life shaped by the limits of the era. Givenchy enters through that same private doorway. Cleveland's memoir describes a long connection between Sterling and Hubert de Givenchy, including time in Givenchy's world in France. Cleveland knew Sterling closely, so her memory carries weight. At the same time, Givenchy left no public confirmation, and official fashion histories rarely preserved private relationships like that, especially when sex, power, race, and reputation all sat inside the same silence. That silence was part of the world Sterling moved through. High fashion in the 1970s had queer people everywhere, but the public language around sexuality stayed careful, polished, and coded. A man could be called a son, a protege, a companion, a muse, a friend, or a house favorite, and each word could hide as much as it revealed. The code gave people room to stay close without turning private life into public confession. It also left fragments instead of declarations. In Sterling's case, the fragments show queer connection and emotional complexity. They do not turn every relationship into a fixed label. A man could be visible on a runway and hidden inside the words used for his closest bonds. He could be desired, invited, photographed, and still denied a public vocabulary that matched his life, even while everyone around him seemed to understand more than they were willing to say. That tension shaped Raymond's family language. It shaped the Givenchy memories. It shaped the way Cleveland remembered their engagement. There was already enough tension in the silence. Sterling's sexuality shaped the words people used for him, the protections they offered, and the erasures they left behind. His public image stayed bright while the private record around him remained unstable. By the late 1970s, Sterling had become part of New York's nightlife mythology. Warhol's diaries place him near the Studio 54 orbit, while photographs tie him to figures like Bianca Jagger and Liza Minnelli. Those were not casual rooms. They were places where fashion, celebrity, money, and desire watched each other closely, and Sterling knew how to move through them without looking borrowed. Studio 54 worked like its own kind of court. Designers, performers, artists, models, socialites, and movie stars came there to be seen as much as to dance. Sterling understood that language. His beauty had currency. His elegance had currency. His dancing had even more. In a room built on selection, attention, and entrance, he looked like someone who belonged near the center. That kind of fame could feel powerful while the music was playing. A night at Studio 54 could bring photographs, introductions, rumors, invitations, and the illusion of permanence. But attention did not always become protection. It did not guarantee contracts, money, agency backing, healthcare, estate records, or a career that could survive once the rooms changed. By 1980, Studio 54 had closed after the legal and financial collapse around its owners. Disco's public image was also turning sour. The backlash carried racism, homophobia, and class contempt along with ordinary cultural fatigue. For someone like Sterling, whose glamour lived inside fashion nightlife, that shift was dangerous. The same world that made him magnetic could also move on without giving him anything solid to stand on. He had been famous in rooms that made people feel immortal for a night. Those rooms could remember his entrance, his face, his movement, and still fail to leave him with the structure that turns attention into a future. "He's the greatest dancer" is the kind of rumor that makes Sterling feel almost too cinematic. The story says Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers saw him dance, carried that image back into the studio, and turned the beautiful man from the club floor into a disco record that kept moving after he disappeared from view. But the song never hands over his name. Rodgers and Edwards did not leave a clear public line tying it to Sterling. When Sister Sledge was asked decades later who the song was about, she did not point to one real man. She described the greatest dancer as an alter ego, a fantasy anyone could step into once the music started. That answer does not push Sterling out of the song's world. If anything, it shows how perfectly he fit the image. The lyrics move around a designer-dressed figure with beauty, money, rhythm, and command, written by men who understood disco from the inside. Sterling lived in that same visual language. He had the clothes, the body, the rooms, and the kind of movement people kept trying to remember after the night ended. So the song stays beside him as legend, not proof. It cannot be treated as a credit, but it also cannot be dismissed as random. Stories attach themselves to people for a reason. In Sterling's case, the rumor survived because he looked like the man the song was chasing. Glamorous, unreachable, watched from across the floor and gone before the record could name him or archive him safely in any official way. When New York's disco world began to shrink, Sterling did not vanish. His name moved toward Europe, where dance music still had room for men like him. Under Sterling St. Jacques, he released Again and I'm a Star around 1980, followed by other disco records in the early 1980s. In 1981, he reached the San Remo Music Festival with Blue, Tutto e Blu. San Remo was an Italian stage, not a club flyer. That European period gives the later years more life than the easy tragedy suggests. Studio 54 had lost its power, but Sterling was still performing. He adjusted to a market where disco and dance pop had not burned out. Even his name began slipping through the paper trail, appearing in ways that look minor on screen, but can split a career into separate fragments again. The fragments from Europe show activity, not instant collapse. A single, a festival appearance, a nightclub listing, and a changed name may look small beside the glamour of New York, but together they show a man trying to work after the rooms that once celebrated him had changed. His releases continue through 1984, including Mr. Moonlight. Italian and French secondary pages point to a Genoa appearance in July 1985, connected to Discoteca Shalom. That late glimpse complicates the versions of his life that place him gone by 1984. It does not solve the ending, but it keeps the door from closing too neatly. Poverty and abandonment are too blunt for what survives. Sterling was rebuilding in a different market after his New York celebrity lost value. He still had recognition in certain circles, but not the structure later male models used to remain visible. A later supermodel might move into television, brand deals, hosting, fragrance campaigns, or autobiography. Sterling moved through records, festival appearances, and European nightclub rooms instead. Europe gave him work. It left him without a clean ending. Sterling's ending refuses one clean date. Some accounts place his death in 1984. Others point to 1985. Later database entries have used 1992. Pat Cleveland's memoir places him inside the grief of the AIDS years, but no verified death certificate has settled the question. A 1988 Chicago Tribune interview with Raymond St. Jacques complicates the earlier dates further, because Raymond spoke of Sterling as alive and working in Dusseldorf. So the ending stays fractured. A man who had been photographed beside major cultural figures reached a final chapter that paperwork still cannot hold. AIDS belongs in this part of his life because the epidemic tore through the fashion, nightlife, and queer worlds Sterling moved through. It brought illness, stigma, silence, missing obituaries, and families forced to grieve privately. Cleveland's memory places him near that loss, while the public trail remains split. The grief around that era is real, even when Sterling's final record refuses to settle. The later legal record adds one more cold trace. After Raymond died in 1990, Jet's probate coverage described an estate worth about $750,000 and listed Sterling as a nephew who received $1. By then, the language around him had already shifted enough to feel unsettling. A man once introduced with intimacy appeared again as a brief legal mention, visible on paper but still unexplained. What remains is not a clean death scene. It is a set of dates that do not agree, a disease-era memory that carries grief without final proof, and a final paper trail that leaves Sterling visible one more time without explaining where he truly ended. Sterling's life becomes distorted in two directions. Turn every gap into legend, and he becomes larger than the evidence can carry. Treat every gap as weakness, and he becomes smaller than the rooms he once commanded. What survives is not nothing. Photographs keep his face. Fashion reviews keep his movement. Warhol's diaries keep him inside the nightlife orbit. Pat Cleveland's memories keep the intimacy. The records keep music released under a slightly altered name. Jet's probate coverage keeps one final legal trace. Together, those pieces show a man who was visible, connected, and professionally active across fashion, nightlife, film, and music. What disappears is steadiness. No settled birth record follows him cleanly. No adoption record makes the Raymond story simple. No agency file turns the career into an easy timeline. No verified death certificate closes the ending. Official fashion memory never held him with the same force his photographs still carry. That kind of loss does not need one villain. Neglect was enough. Racism was enough. The low status of male modeling was enough. Queer code was enough. Nightlife was enough, because nightlife creates witnesses before documents. Sterling stood at the crossing of all those weak points. Fame reached him in person before institutions learned how to keep him when the lights changed and the witnesses scattered. The result is visible everywhere. A name that shifts, a family bond that changes on paper, a Givenchy memory without public confirmation, a Studio 54 presence preserved in fragments, a European career split by spelling and distance, and an ending that refuses one date. None of those gaps cancels him. Together, they show how a person can be known intensely in life and still arrive in history half protected. The damage sits in the missing pieces. Sterling had presence, beauty, movement, and access. None of it was enough on its own. Presence alone could not survive the systems around him for long. Sterling St. Jacques did not leave fashion with the clean shape the industry prefers. Tyson Beckford's later breakthrough came with Ralph Lauren campaigns, agency power, magazine attention, and a media system that knew how to turn a male model into a public figure. Beckford earned that place. Sterling belonged to an earlier, rougher moment when a black man could enter the most glamorous rooms in fashion and still leave with no structure strong enough to protect his name. What remains is a life seen in flashes. A dancer from Salt Lake City reached national television, entered Raymond St. Jacques' Hollywood world, walked for Yves Saint Laurent, drew notice at Givenchy, moved beside Pat Cleveland, and became part of the Studio 54 atmosphere where fashion and nightlife fed each other. Then his path carried him into European disco, where the glamour looked smaller on paper but still showed him working. The gaps around him are not side details, they are part of the wound. Versailles has never clearly held his name. The Sister Sledge story lives as rumor, not credit. The Givenchy relationship survives through Cleveland's memory more than public confirmation. The adoption story changes once it reaches legal paper. His death date still breaks apart across different accounts. Each missing piece changes the outline, but none of them erases the man. Sterling's tragedy begins with how visible he actually was. He was photographed, watched, invited, desired, and remembered. Being known in those rooms did not become protection once the rooms emptied. Fashion could recognize his presence without building him a future. Nightlife could make him unforgettable without giving him anything stable to carry afterward. A legal document could reduce a complicated bond to one word and $1. The glamour is clear. The harm is in how little of that glamour ever became anything permanent for him after the music stopped. That is the sting still sitting under the glamour. The question reaches beyond whether Sterling was the first black male supermodel. It reaches into how someone could stand so close to the center of beauty, money, fame, and desire, then still become difficult to trace. He may never receive the clean crown history likes to hand out. What he does receive, if his name is spoken carefully, is something harder to dismiss. Proof that he was there, and proof that being there was never enough.